Good evening, everyone. Thank you to everyone who's joined us today at the American Society of International Law, and to everyone who's joining us online as well. My name is Ide Dijkstal. I'm a barrister at 33 Bedford Row Chambers in London, and I'm instructed as counsel on behalf of individuals arbitrarily detained in Saudi Arabia. I want to start by thanking our hosts, the American Society of International Law, for hosting this discussion, and also our co-sponsors, Freedom Forward and PEN America, for supporting this conversation. So this event was organized in order to address the pattern of human rights violations in Saudi Arabia, particularly the arbitrary detention and treatment of individuals who peacefully express concern or criticism of government actions and policies, the use of anti-terrorism laws, and severe prison sentences, even the death penalty, for those expressing their opinion and their abusive treatment and detention in violation of their fundamental human rights. During today's discussion, you'll hear details on individual cases, which highlight the gravity of the pattern of abuses. This also includes cases whereby family members of those who exercise the right to free expression are targeted, such as the shocking case of Ida Al-Ghamdi, the mother of Abdullah Al-Ghamdi, who is nearly 70 years old and arbitrarily detained since March 2018, nearly 2,500 days, during which time she's been kept in solitary confinement and tortured. In addition to raising alarm and awareness about this trend, today's discussion will look to human rights obligations and mechanisms for addressing this trend and protecting human rights. So before we start, just a bit of housekeeping. We have our discussion, and then we'll have a question and answer section at the end. For those of you joining online, feel free to enter any questions in the Zoom comments on Zoom, and we can see them here and we'll incorporate them into our discussion. And then, of course, everyone here in the room can ask your questions live. Q&A. Yes, yeah, during the Q&A section. Sorry, not in the comments section on Zoom, but the Q&A section on the Zoom for those joining on Zoom. Before I introduce our speakers, we'll be playing a video, a pre-recorded statement from Dr. Syed Al-Ghamdi, whose brother, Mohammed Al-Ghamdi, was arrested 2 years ago today and subsequently sentenced to death for charges concerning his expression of concern about government policies on Twitter with an account that had no more than 10 followers. And about the fact that, that he also followed and viewed YouTube accounts as well that contributed to his death sentence also. So we'll play that statement now.
يعبر الناس عن أفكارهم وأعمارهم والحوار والنقاش هذا بحرية تامة ودون خوف. لكن في بلدي يحدث العكس تماما. ففي المملكة العربية السعودية لا يستطيع أحد أن يقول رأيه في الأمور العامة، بل حتى في أحوال المجتمع العادية بسبب خوفهم من الحكومة السعودية. لأن أي انتقاد أو ممارسة للحق المشروع في التعبير فضلاً عن انتقاد الحكومة أو أدائها فإن مصيره الاعتقال والسجن والإخفاء القسري والأحكام القضائية المسيسة. لكم أن تتخيلوا أن يحكم على شخص بالسجن لمدة 30 أو 40 سنة لمجرد تغريدات في تويتر معروف الآن بإكس، بل تخيلوا ما هو أشد وأعظم، أن يحكم على شخص بالإعدام لأجل تغريدات في حساب وهمي على منصة إكس يتابعه 9 أشخاص فقط. وهذا ما حصل فعلا لشقيقي محمد بن ناصر الغامدي الذي اعتقله الأمن السعودي بطريقة مشينة وعنيفة بسبب 5 تغريدات في منصة إكس. فحكم عليه القاضي بعد اعتقال طويل وحبس انفرادي، حكم عليه بالإعدام ولم يسمح له باستئناف الحكم حتى الآن. وتعرض خلال فترة اعتقاله للتعذيب والإهمال الطبي المتعمد، وصحته الآن متردية وسيئة للأسف الشديد، ومنذ أشهر وهو يحاول أن يعرض على الطبيب المختص ولم يحصل ذلك. لقد كان لاعتقال شقيقي محمد أثر بالغ جدا على كل العائلة، وخصوصا على زوجته وأطفاله وجميع زملائه وأصدقائه. لقد فقدته أسرته واشتاقت عائلته وأطفاله لوجوده بينهم. إنه شخص مسالم لا يوجد له أي نشاط سياسي، وكل ما فعله هو أنه عبر عن رأيه في بضع تغريدات، بعضها عن ارتفاع الأسعار فقط. ومحمد بن سلمان الذي ادعى أسفه وخجله من الحكم الصادر ضد أخي في مقابلة تلفزيونية منشورة ومشهورة، هو نفسه محمد بن سلمان من يحرض على اعتقال كل من ينتقده أو يعبر عن رأيه ولو عبر مواقع التواصل الاجتماعي. وللأسف الشديد القضاء في بلادي فاسد بسبب سيطرة محمد بن سلمان وحكومته عليه وتوجيههم له، ولذلك تصدر من هذا القضاء هذه الأحكام الجائرة التي لا يقبلها عقل ولا منطق ولا قانون.
All right. Thank you so much. That's really helpful in demonstrating the impact that these abuses have on family members and individuals who are detained for expressing their exercising their right to free expression. I'm going to now introduce our panel, who need no introduction, but I'm very happy to welcome them. Our first panelist is Abdullah Al-Oda. Abdullah is the Countering Authoritarianism Senior Director at the Middle East Democracy Center. Previously, he served as the Saudi Director at the Freedom Initiative. He was a visiting adjunct professor at the Elliott School at George Washington University and served for 2 years as senior fellow at the Al-Wadal Center for Muslim Christian Understanding and at the Edward A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. Before joining Freedom Initiative, he served as director for the Gulf Director for the Gulf at the Democracy for the Arab World Now, DAWN, the NGO here in DC. Abdullah is the Secretary General and co-founder of the National Assembly Party, Saudi Arabia's first openly declared political party, which calls for an elected parliament and constitutional safeguards in Saudi Arabia. He is also signatory and one of the drafters of the Saudi people's vision for reform, a blueprint for democracy and human rights in Saudi Arabia. Our next speaker is Sanjeev Barry. Sanjeev serves as Executive Director of Freedom Forward. Previously, he served as Advocacy Director for the Middle East and North Africa at Amnesty International USA, where he lobbied US officials, diplomats, and office holders regarding human rights concern across the MENA region. As regional director he also served as regional director for American Civil Liberties Union, where his work included advocacy on post-9/11 security policies, as a public interest lobbyist on student financial aid issues in Washington, D.C., and as a fundraiser for environmental and human rights organizations. Elizabeth Ragibi is the Advocacy Director for the Middle East and North Africa at Amnesty International USA. In this role, she leads Amnesty's USA government advocacy on human rights issues across the MENA region. Prior to this, she served as the Levant researcher for the Cairo Institute for Human Rights Studies based in Tunis, Tunisia, where she conducted human rights research and advocacy on Palestine and Syria at the United Nations, European Union, and before national governments in close collaboration with civil society organizations based in the MENA region. And finally, we have Hadar Harris, and she is the managing director of in Washington of PEN America. She's an award-winning international human rights attorney who has worked for more than 2 decades on a broad range of human rights issues in more than 25 countries. Prior to joining PEN America, Hadar was the executive director of the Student Press Law Center, the nation's only legal assistance organization developed exclusively to support student news media in their struggle to cover important issues of censorship. And she also served as the executive director of the Northern California Innocence Project, which works to exonerate the innocent to reform the criminal justice center. And welcome to all our panelists. So to start our discussion today, I'm going to ask a question of Abdullah. Human rights organizations and even the United Nations have consistently reported on what they have called a crackdown on freedom of expression in the country, in Saudi Arabia, which has impacted the voices of women, human rights defenders, opposition, and ordinary citizens expressing their concern and dissent, in addition to violations of other human rights and freedoms. Can you give further information from your work and personal experience on instances where the right to free expression and also other human rights have been violated in Saudi Arabia? And then also with reports of demolitions in various cities, can you maybe expand on how that impacts human rights as well?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. So I want to start with saying that Saudi Arabia has never been democratic. And the idea of crackdown did not start with MBS in 2017. But what the Saudi Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, has done is he actually made it worse, and he embarked on unprecedented level of oppression that we haven't seen even in the Arabian Peninsula, in the Arabian Peninsula's history. So what Mohammed bin Salman did in the system is that he transformed the monarchy that has always been absolute monarchy into a one-man show instead of one family. He also basically, and you're gonna hear a lot from like folks about like laws in Saudi Arabia and from my colleagues here about some of the laws that have been criticized. But what Mohammed bin Salman did since he came to power is that he actually started basically a systematic adoption of the oppression that had been there for a long time, but it was done by certain people, individuals. He like started saying that Saudi Arabia will never be democratic. I'm gonna just like give like very quick show of this, meaning when King Abdulaziz like founded modern Saudi Arabia, he said that they're going to be parliaments at one point. King Fahd at one point, he said there's going to be an elected parliament, half elected parliament, and then later we're going to have fully elected parliament, but with like you know, with less powers. When King Abdullah came to power, he said, a constitutional monarchy is my vision. He said that to some reformists. None of that, you know, materialized. But what Mohammed bin Salman did is he became more honest. He said, well, there's no democracy. I'm not going to be democratic. Just forget it. I'm going to be this absolute monarch. I'm going to rule with an iron fist and forget all of that. And I think he is keeping his promise so far. And you're going to see this in multiple levels. One important thing is the freedom of expression, as you said. Prior to Mohammed bin Salman, there was a margin of what we call a margin of freedom. It was never like free, but there was a margin that we within the country were able to, for example, demand for democracy. We were able to mobilize to a certain level. We were able to demand, democracy. And then when Mohammed bin Salman came to power, he basically shut off completely the public sphere. He shut down every possibility and margin that we ever had freedom to ask or demand anything. And since he came to power, he actually said he's going to modernize in basically and mainly three aspects: economy, religion, and social aspect. Economy, he said he's going to diversify the Saudi economy. Socially, he said he's going to, quote unquote, liberalize women and society. And religiously, he said he's going to bring back Saudi Arabia to pre-1979, which is the year that witnessed the Iranian Revolution and the besiege of Mecca at that time, meaning like prior to the Islamist Saudi Arabia, as he said. What he actually did, when he started the campaign in 2017, when he said he's going to diversify the Saudi economy, he started by arresting the very prominent economists that actually called to diversify the Saudi economy, meaning like Isam al-Zamil, Jamil Farisi, and prominent economists that actually asked to diversify the Saudi economy. When he said he's going to adopt a reformist and moderate Islam, he started by arresting the very moderate Muslims that have in their agenda this democratic rhetoric, and arrested them, put them in jail, tortured them, like Hassan al-Malki, my father Salman al-Auda, and so many other people. When he said he's going to liberalize women, he started by arresting the very minds and people who actually pushed for the agenda for women not to be liberalized by the government, but to be free, like Lujain al-Hudlul, Iman al-Nafjan, Aziza al-Yusuf, and you name it. And he not just arrested them and silenced them, he put them in jail, tortured them, sexually harassed them, electrocuted them. And this is not according to me, according to international reports, to the UN, to the Guardian, to every organization that actually documented these cases, including Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, and others. And finally, to talk about like freedom of speech, Mohammed bin Salman and the Saudi government is obsessed over social media. For me, for obvious reasons, because most of the people you see, for example, in this room, and I think most of the people watch us are young people. And if you look at the generation in Saudi Arabia, like 70 to 75% of the Saudi population is between the age of 18 and 35. And those folks, they almost solely exist on social media. They socialize, they mobilize, they work, they talk, they do everything on social media. And therefore, Mohammed bin Salman, who is still within our generation, wanted to make sure that the new generation does not speak against his will. The new generation does not witness something that he is not comfortable with. The new generation does not hear talks about like freedoms, about democracy, about consultation, about participatory politics. These terms that he deemed very threatening and existential threats to him. So therefore he tried to control, and he completely controlled like the internal discussion of this, even over social media. But he's trying to even to influence it either through the bots, which is the electronic flies, through abusing algorithms with money, with funds, with everything, through influencing the public, through by like lobbying, by throwing money into sports watching, culture watching, and things like that. I just want to stop to allow my colleagues to elaborate on these things.
Thank you so much. I'm going to move now to Elizabeth. We've seen with many human rights organizations, including Amnesty, that concern has been raised about this trend and this crackdown, but that also individual cases have been raised as well. I'm wondering if you could give more detail about the campaign that Amnesty had and about particular cases as well.
Sure. Can everybody hear me? Thank you all for joining us today and taking the time to hear from us, and a large thank you to our organizers and hosts for making this important conversation happen. So earlier this year, Amnesty International launched a campaign that we're calling the Kingdom of Repression, and it's a global campaign. The goal of this campaign is to build international pressure for human rights reforms in Saudi Arabia by exposing the worsening human rights reality and to counter the image of glitz and glamour that's being projected by the authorities through their sports washing and other campaigns that you just mentioned. In this campaign, our primary call is for the release of individuals imprisoned or sentenced to death for their peaceful expression. As part of this, it includes a petition directed at Saudi authorities calling on them to release these individuals that are wrongfully detained. And we're also making an effort to really bring a human face to these cases. There are stories behind these cases, real people that are impacted, friends, families, and loved ones that are also impacted by the severe repression in Saudi Arabia. With virtually no civic space in the country, the Saudi authorities in the last 2 years have increasingly turned their attention to target less high-profile people without an extensive activist past, and slamming them with heavy prison sentences and even a death sentence in one case that I will discuss that's actually already been mentioned a bit as well. And so this has a great chilling effect for posting online about women's rights, commenting on the economic situation, calling for the release of detained activists or clerics. And this has been even from individuals with social media accounts with extremely low followers. We're not talking about influential activists that have a large audience that are looking at their social media activity. And so within this campaign, we're focusing on 5 specific cases. And so I'm just going to quickly give you a little bit of details about the 5 individuals that we're really trying to uplift throughout the course of this campaign. And so for our first case, we have Salma Shihab, and she is a Saudi activist and academic from the Shia minority. She was arrested in January 2021, a few days before she was due to return to the United Kingdom, where she was returning to continue her PhD studies at the University of Leeds. Now, in her case, she was accused of, quote, disturbing public order for using Twitter and retweeting activists who support women's rights. Initially, she was sentenced to 6 years in prison. Upon appeal, this was increased to 34 years, which would be followed by a 34-year travel ban. This was later reduced to 27 years in prison. And so just looking at her case in particular, you can see the variation, the unpredictability of what sentences can look like for such charges, and can be incredibly severe. In another case that we're focusing on is that of Manahel Al-Utaibi. She's a young fitness instructor and artist who frequently promoted women's rights on social media. Now, she was arrested in November 2022, and her only crimes were tweeting in support of women's rights and posting a photograph of herself without an abaya. And an abaya is a traditional loose-fitting black robe. In the most recent information that we've received about her case, she is being held in solitary confinement with a broken leg after being beaten in detention, and she's been denied medical care. I think what's interesting in her case specifically, and was also previously mentioned to an extent, is that her case really exposes the hypocrisy between statements by Mohammed bin Salman in the Western media, so the kind of image he's trying to promote externally versus what the reality is for people living in Saudi Arabia, and in this case, specifically women. is that, so in Western media, he claims that the decision is entirely left for women to decide what type of decent and respectful attire she chooses to wear. And in reality, we see in the case of Manahel that she was actually arrested for not wearing an abaya and posting this on social media. In another case that I think really exemplifies this trend towards targeting people that are not, as I mentioned, prominent activists or with prominent followings, is the case of Muhammad al-Ghamdi, a retired teacher who was sentenced to death for his peaceful online activity in July 2023. And he was charged under the counterterrorism law. Saudi Arabia's counterterrorism law has been used extensively to silence and repress freedom of expression in the country. As was mentioned earlier, he has a total of just 10 followers on his social media accounts, and we see the death sentence in his case as an egregious and marked escalation in the kingdom's crackdown on any form of dissent. In our fourth case, we have Muhammad al-Qahtani, a human rights defender, and he was arrested for his work in peaceful activism. This case is a bit older, going back to March 2012. In 2013, he was sentenced to 10 years in prison. He has since been subjected to enforced disappearance and has been denied visits and contact with his family since October 2023. And actually, his prison sentence expired in November of 2022, but he, however, remains detained by the Saudi authorities. So he's completed his sentence, but remains in prison. And lastly, we have Abdurrahman Asadan, a Red Crescent worker who was sentenced in April 2020 to 20 years in prison and a 20-year travel ban on trumped-up charges under the anti-cybercrime and counterterrorism laws based on satirical tweets that he posted. And in this case, his trial was marred with violations, including possible torture that was used to extract a so-called confession. So these are the 5 cases that Amnesty has been highlighting and will continue to highlight throughout the course of our campaign and continue to raise both with the Saudi authorities and with governments around the world that can influence and pressure the Saudi Arabian government for their immediate release. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to move to Hadar now. We've just heard about the gravity of the situation, but maybe we could also hear a little bit about the scope of it as well. Protections of the right to free expression are not only for ordinary citizens expressing their opinions or for activists, but also for writers and authors and artists. So could you speak a bit about the broad range of protections that the right to free expression should have, and also about what PEN America has been doing on this issue?
Thanks, and thanks to everybody for both being here, to ASIL and to our co-sponsors for organizing today. It's such an important discussion, and it is not a discussion that is getting a lot of traction. And that's maybe because of Ronaldo, and maybe it's because, and sorry, we're Messi fans over in my family, but that predated Ronaldo going over there. And it's because of some of the things that we've touched on a little bit: sports washing, glamorous weddings, and various things that are kind of trying to use expression in a way that covers up the crackdown on expression in the kingdom and what's happening to real people.
Could you just,
I'm sorry,
having some trouble hearing you online.
I'm sorry. I won't talk about Ronaldo and Messi anymore, but PEN America stands at the intersection of literature and human rights, and we work on free expression issues in the United States and worldwide. And one of the things that we do every year is to publish a Freedom to Write Index, which tracks writers who are unjustly imprisoned or detained and who are subject to abuse by the state on the basis of their writing and their work. Saudi Arabia, for the 5th year in a row, is in the top 3 of jailers of writers in the world. How that breaks down and what that means has been sort of touched upon by the previous speakers, because the specific cases that you've heard about, the discussion that we've had is about a lot of people who are being jailed or abused in some way or another because of their online presence, Why is that though? We work with, writers who publish books and journalists, but in Saudi Arabia, there is no independent literary culture or ability to publish books independently. There is no ability to be an independent journalist. And therefore, in Saudi Arabia, like in many other authoritarian regimes, there's very little space for freedom of expression. One space that still exists in some ways are social media outlets, which is why you see with a regime that is so focused on their external profile in the way that the world perceives them. You have some authoritarian governments that really don't care one way or the other, the way that they look to the outside world. They're going to do what they're going to do. Belarus, we can name a whole bunch of them. But in Saudi Arabia, they're very, very conscious of what it looks like from the outside. And when you have cases like the transnational, the ultimate case of transnational repression of Jamal Khashoggi, where there is still impunity and there has been no accountability in a real term, then you have a regime that is sort of emboldened to do bad things to their people. And when they are arresting people and imprisoning them for extraordinarily long prison terms, and I think it's really important to note, we heard 27 years. We have a variety of different cases here about Osama Khaled, who was a volunteer administrator for Wikipedia, who is currently serving 32 years in prison, right? We have a whole list of cases that we can go through, and it's important to name them. But for brevity at the moment, we can go back to them if we want to. Know that there is a trend and there is an ongoing pattern by the government of cracking down on people who express dissent in any form, in any way, and sentence them under certain laws that we've talked about, but also with very vague charges that result in these long sentences. And even when they are released, they continue to be in cages where they are restricted from using social media, or they have travel bans placed upon them. So they can't go outside of the country to talk about what may have happened to them. We have case after case of that. So it's important to understand the context. In Saudi Arabia this year, in the Freedom to Write Index, we identified 47 writers who are currently at risk and 19 writers who are currently behind bars. Again, this is the 5th year in a row that Saudi Arabia is in the top 3 of states that are cracking down and are detaining and imprisoning writers, excuse me. The PEN America works to elevate and to amplify what's happening to writers, what's happening to bloggers, what's happening to people based on their online expression. Because oftentimes we don't look at those folks as human rights defenders. But we know that in a very constrained context like Saudi Arabia, the ideas, the ways in which writers and authors are able to express themselves are the ways in which storytellers create narratives that sometimes are dangerous to an authoritarian regime, but that open the minds of people to be able to think about a future in which they are not oppressed day to day. So that is why PEN America works on these issues, why we're very concerned about what's happening in Saudi Arabia, and why this conversation is so incredibly important.
Well, Hadar, I'm so glad that you raised the fact that this issue is not getting the traction it deserves. And I want to move to Sanjeev and speak about this traction and how this issue is being recognized globally. So could you address the legal and policy measures that are being taken here in the United States, but also internationally, to constructively address this issue of crackdown on fundamental rights, and also to encourage policy change in Saudi Arabia as well?
Sure, thank you. And can you hear me okay? And thanks to our hosts for this wonderful event and for everyone joining us here in person and online. I appreciate it. I'm sure I'm not the only one here who can speak to some of these detailed questions of the policy tools. And so I'm looking forward to other folks' comments as well. But they largely fall into a few key buckets. There's diplomatic pressure, there's soft power, and then there's the specific question of Western and global supplies of arms and other forms of support to Saudi Arabia's monarchy, the sort of the cement of Western governments' alliances with the monarchy or the Saudi dictatorship. And within each of these buckets, there are different tools. You know, there's the Leahy Law, which enables the United States and requires the United States to cut off military funding, for example, to foreign military units that receive U.S. military funding. There are rules on the books for not providing direct military sales to governments where there's a high probability or likelihood or a record of those weapons or arms being used in human rights violations. And unfortunately, what we're seeing today here in the United States is that instead of engaging with these tools from the bully pulpit of the microphone of the Oval Office to the diplomatic pressure to actually cutting off weapons or ending U.S. military support for Saudi Arabia's monarchy in its entirety, unfortunately, the U.S. government has done the opposite. And the Biden administration has actually continued and extended the policies of the Trump administration. You might recall that the Trump administration doubled down on the U.S.-Saudi alliance through the so-called Abraham Accords. And it's the Biden administration that's deepened that and formalized that. And in fact, right now, the Biden administration is pulling out the rug from under a lot of voices for human rights and democracy in the Middle East by trying to lock in an even stronger U.S. military alliance with Saudi Arabia's dictatorship. And they are attempting to push this right now as we speak. And so this is the difficult reality that we face right now, which is that many dictatorships operate with the consent and support of their allies internationally. That's not always true. Some are deeply isolated, but many are empowered by other governments. And so much of the work to support political freedom in Saudi Arabia means holding our own US government accountable. And for those in the United Kingdom or Canada or elsewhere, it's similar, to make sure and to put pressure on the governments to do what they should do, but in many cases, what they're already legally required to do, but are not doing. And it's not just Saudi Arabia, of course. Israel, for example, is probably the worst example right now of a government armed and supported by the United States in violation of the US's own laws, as it conducts a very clear campaign of gross human rights atrocities. And so this is the fundamental reality that we face. And there's a further danger to this, which is that the U.S. government is currently at risk of enabling the Saudi monarchy to become even worse in its human rights violations internally and externally. The U.S. is already a major supplier of weapons to Saudi Arabia. The Saudi Arabia, as I understand it, is the largest arms customer for the United States. If the United States, under the Biden administration, signs an even stronger deal with Saudi Arabia's monarchy, not the Saudi people, but the monarchy, that will be even more of a blank check to the Saudi monarchy to do whatever it wants to do internally and externally. And this is a monarchy that has already helped starve and kill thousands of people, for example, in Yemen. So these are the difficult realities, and the human rights impunity is not just that of the Saudi monarchy, it's also of US policymakers, both under the Trump administration and the Biden administration, that continue to arm and support and maintain relationships with a monarchy that has long demonstrated total hostility to freedom of speech, freedom of association, et cetera. And so for all of us who are concerned about human rights, it's critical to lift up the cases of the individuals in Saudi Arabia who continue to be imprisoned, jailed, tortured for simply exercising their basic rights of speech, association, belief, even visual self-presentation in the case of women choosing to dress how they want to dress, and to hold our own governments accountable and to leverage the relationships our allies have to push our own governments, including the US government, to take a stand that actually means something, which is to withdraw support from the monarchy that is committing these human rights crimes every single day.
Well, thank you. We've heard about the gravity and the scope of these cases, the reality of the situation, and then also about recognition of the problem. But I think in order to fully understand it, we also need to address the laws which make this possible in Saudi Arabia. So Abdullah, if I could come back to you. Could you give a bit more information about the use of anti-terrorism laws in order to crack down on free expression, and then also how the specialized criminal court is also used as a tool to suppress free expression?
So yeah, part of what Mohammed Salman did again since he came to power is he basically embarked on this project of institutionalizing repression, and the main tools of repression were basically legally two laws. One is anti-cybercrime law and counter-terrorism law, and from the judiciary side, the specialized criminal court, which is basically what's commonly known as the terrorism court. More recently, also, they started to activate more and more military courts that they try those who have served even at one point in one part of the Saudi military. And we have cases of people, for example, that I followed, people who were prosecuted and arrested, not because they have done anything during their service in the military, but rather because they said something online critical of MBS, and then they found out later that at one point they served in the military, so they sent them to the military court to be tried as quote unquote traitors, with a lot of times accusations relating to high treasons and things like really, really serious. And we have people whom the prosecutors in Saudi Arabia are seeking the death penalty against based on these kind of charges. So what the specialized criminal court does is actually implement laws like the counter-terrorism law that criminalizes, for example, any shred of mobilization protected by any, democratic or free country in the world. And part of what the counter-terrorism law does is, for example, criminalizes what they called questioning the trustworthiness of the king or crown prince. So just imagine questioning the trustworthiness of the crown prince or the king is an act of terrorism punishable by the Saudi law by ranging from like 10 years to 30 to 35 years sometimes, if you add other things and other factors like discretionary punishments and other things. We have people like get sentenced or get the prosecutors seeking even the death penalty against them based on these two laws, the cybercrime law and the counter-terrorism law. The cybercrime law, for example, criminalizes any public statement in any social media or any public setting that actually, quote unquote, threatens the social fabric, whatever that means. For example, threatening the social fabric can be something like, I don't like what the municipality does in Riyadh, or why the bridge in Jeddah is not, working properly, or something like, why. I mean, we have expats who were arrested because they criticized the traffic in one city in Saudi Arabia, and they were asked by the investigators and you know, of why they have been critical and they bite in the arm that give them everything in Saudi Arabia. So that's basically something you can be prosecuted over in Saudi Arabia. So we're talking about like not just abusing law and you know, arbitrary detention. Like I remember, like I just want to like give this example to illustrate what I'm going to say and end with it, which is I remember in 2011 we were shouting that we need to implement the law when other, you know, neighboring countries like in Egypt or elsewhere, they said الشعب يريد إسقاط النظام, you know, the people demands to overthrow the regime. We say الشعب يريد تطبيق النظام. We want to implement the law because at the time people were demanding to implement the criminal procedures that had some kind of protection, you know, against arbitrary detention and things like that, you know, relatively speaking, you know. But what happened, like MBS learned the lesson, but he went the wrong way, meaning he said, well, you want to implement the law. Guess what? I'm going to enact laws that I'm going to implement that will make things that were arbitrary now according to the law, but what I want, according to what I want and to what I act and will. And that's what he did with these laws. So basically you can be perfectly prosecuted according to the Saudi law this time, but the Saudi law will allow and enable the system, the judge, the prosecutors, lawyers to prosecute you over silly comments, over silly acts. There are people who were picked up from the street because they, for example, had signed, or they taken pictures, or recording, or doing things that are really, you know, simple and otherwise should be protected by the law.
Thank you. Elizabeth, I'm going to come back to you, and I want to ask another question about the legal system in Saudi Arabia that is adjudicating these cases. In September of 2023, Mohammed bin Salman acknowledged that in the case of Mohammed al-Ghamdi, which you mentioned before, and which resulted in a death sentence, was the result of bad laws. This comes after legislative reforms, including of Saudi Arabia's penal code, or the announcement of legislative reforms that were announced in order to preserve rights and to protect human rights. So can you speak a bit more, or can you speak about the what steps have been taken in these legislative reforms and whether they've been positive or whether they've exacerbated the situation?
Sure. So maybe before I jump into that, just to set the stage a little bit, right? So since Mohammed bin Salman ascended to power in 2017, the human rights situation has become worse than it has been in the last 30 years. And this is according to Amnesty International's documentation, which we began documenting abuses in Saudi Arabia 30 years ago. So it's the worst that we've seen. So following the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi in 2018, Saudi authorities have gone into overdrive to rehabilitate their international image. And as you just mentioned in the question, MBS has also sought to position himself as a progressive reformer. And as part of this, he announced a package of legal reforms in February 2021 that he promised, or he claimed, would protect human rights, bolster principles of justice, and enforce transparency, all while adhering to Islamic law principles. And so this package included a few different legislative reforms. I'm going to focus on the penal code, excuse me, which was the focus of the latest Amnesty International report. So this would actually be Saudi Arabia's first penal code. So you may not know that they actually don't have an existing penal code. So in March of this year, Amnesty published a report titled Manifesto for Repression, and this report analyzes a leaked draft of the penal code. So the penal code has not been made law. It is in process, and we were able to get access to a draft that was leaked online publicly, and we believe it to be an authentic working draft. So if Saudi Arabia does not have a penal code, how are they prosecuting crimes? How does the system work? So I'm going to touch on this a little bit, and then go into some of the key ways in which the draft version of the penal code would further codify and entrench violations of freedom of expression. So without an existing penal code, judges use their interpretation of Islamic law and jurisprudence in Saudi Arabia to determine what constitutes a crime and to impose punishments. And so such a practice allows judges to have wide discretion in adjudicating cases, which results in arbitrary imposition of punishments that vary in severity across similar offenses and cases. And I think you saw some examples of those in the cases that I mentioned earlier, pretty wide-ranging sentences and punishments for social media activity in those cases. And so this wide judicial discretion also enables authorities to use the judiciary to settle political scores and to retaliate against anyone who questions the authorities' political and economic agendas. And in a system where there is no penal code, this also often leaves individuals unaware of what constitutes a crime or what its punishments might be. So this leads to a lot of unpredictability and clarity. So this proposed penal code was supposed to resolve these issues, to bring more clarity, to bring more standardization of criminal processes in the kingdom. However, in Amnesty's analysis of the draft penal code, we found that it fails to meet its promises of protecting and upholding human rights. And it would actually codify and entrench existing repressive judicial practices. So just to take a look at a few different aspects of the penal code. The penal code in its draft form, it deals with a wide range of issues. So I would encourage you to check out the report if you're interested, dealing with issues of bodily autonomy, religious belief, and a number of other issues. I'm going to focus mostly or exclusively on issues pertaining to freedom of expression. So the draft code criminalizes freedom of expression by codifying as crimes and prescribing punishments for defamation, insult, and questioning the integrity of the judiciary. It also includes as crimes vague terms such as indecent acts or words affecting honor, which are overly broad and not recognizable offenses under international law. And to touch on the laws that you just discussed, the draft law also does not amend problematic provisions in existing laws, such as the anti-cybercrime law and the counterterrorism law that have been used to silence freedom of expression and dissent. In addition to these aspects, the draft code includes problematic provisions that have been used to silence dissent and punish human rights defenders, for which it stipulates prison terms and fines. And so in this case, these would be prison terms or fines for anyone who uses public means to question the integrity of the judiciary or one of its members, or their commitment to provisions of Islamic law, or their commitment to regulations in performing their work. So any kind of criticism or questioning of the judiciary would result in punishment according to the draft code. Furthermore, the draft code also introduces a new crime imposing criminal penalties on anyone who offends the reputation of another, anyone who uses insulting words towards someone's honor, even if not publicly, even if it's not done so publicly, which would be punishable by prison terms and or fines. And so the criminalization of insults, either private or public, could be instrumentalized by the Saudi authorities to continue their crackdown on freedom of expression and dissent. And I'll just also note that the code does not define honor, which opens this up to the discretion of the judge. And I'll also add that the code codifies frequent use of the death penalty as one of the primary punishments, rather than limiting its use, which is what Saudi authorities had promised they were going to do. So if made into law, this code would codify death penalty as a primary punishment. All forward. And I would also add that, as we mentioned before, without a penal code, the problem is that judges have wide discretion about determining what are crimes and what the punishments might be. And so this draft code actually further codifies and entrenches this level of discretion for judges, giving them the right to determine whether a crime meets the evidentiary threshold for fixed punishments. Fixed punishments include the death penalty and corporal punishment under Islamic law. And I would just close by saying, you know, one of the reasons Amnesty decided to move forward with publishing a report on a draft version of the law. Why would we do this? Because now is our chance to call for change, to call for reform, to try to have some kind of impact on what this penal code will look like before it does become law, which is what we're extremely concerned about. And so in continuing to engage with the US government and others to try to impact what this penal code is ultimately going to be once passed. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
It's really helpful to hear about how Amnesty is following the announcement of legislative and legal reforms, but also how it's recognized as a way that Saudi Arabia has tried to address its international image. So Sanjeev, I'd like to come to you and ask about another way that Saudi Arabia has tried to address its international image, that being sports washing. If you could address how there's been growing concerns about the way that sporting events and even entertainment events have been used to draw attention away from the abuses that we've been discussing today, and then what groups are doing, like human rights organizations, to address this issue and try to bring back the conversation to these cases and make sure that there's still attention on them.
Sure, thank you. You know, I think it's probably no surprise that Saudi Arabia's monarchy spends a lot of money trying to buy legitimacy internationally. Sports washing is one example of that. You could call it entertainment washing, flying out global celebrities and paying them a lot of money to perform, like Justin Bieber performing in Saudi Arabia, as well as, you know, cultural projections of power, a Saudi funding relationship with UNESCO, for example, and on and on and on. And all of this money is essentially laundered oil wealth. The money comes from Aramco through the Saudi Public Investment Fund, which is you could say the investment account through which Saudi Arabia, the Saudi monarchy's oil money is then channeled. And in the sports arena alone, the Saudi monarchy has spent billions of dollars in recent years. You know, they bought Newcastle United Football Club. They have the Saudi Grand Prix. The other examples as well. There's Live Golf, you know, where PGA and Live actually merged, you know, and created a new entity through the flexing of Saudi financial might. And all of this is part of an attempt to kind of buy legitimacy and to add a certain shininess or sheen of glamour to the underlying that obscures the underlying brutality of an unelected government. You know, this is all stolen money. This is money that belongs to the Saudi people. This is money that should be decided, how the money is spent should be decided by the Saudi people, not by a crown prince who decides, you know, he wants to buy a football team over here or create a golf league over there. But instead, what you're having is a monarchy that's burning a vast amount of money that's already generated through the burning of destructive fossil fuels, ultimately, to buy that legitimacy and to attempt to distract the world from the realities of what the Saudi monarchy does. I think there's another piece of this that's worth considering, which is that this is also part of the deal that the monarchy is presenting to people in Saudi Arabia. Keep your mouth shut. Don't ask any questions. Go to the high-profile entertainment we're providing, right? It's sort of the bread and circuses model, right? And so vast amounts of money are being spent in this way. Human rights organizations and campaigners have forced the question of whether it's legitimate for national and international organizations to partner with Saudi Arabia's monarchy or take its money. You know, every time the monarchy engages in one of these adventures, they face a range of blistering headlines from many of our organizations and other organizations. And this works to continue to lift back up the stories of the individual people who have been imprisoned wrongly by the Saudi monarchy under its repressive system. But ultimately, there's a deeper question, which is the question of who gets to decide how the Saudi government spends its money. That is a decision that ought to be up to the Saudi people. And that means that Saudi Arabia ought to be governed ultimately by institutions that are decided by the Saudi people. And that's why Freedom Forward and other organizations here and outside of this room are proud to support the people's vision that Abdullah, our colleague here, has spoken about, a call for democracy and human rights in Saudi Arabia. There's no reason why, in a world where so many other monarchies have given way over the past 1, 2, 3 centuries to democratic systems, that Western governments and other governments ought to be continuing to partner and have military alliances with this repressive monarchy under Mohammed bin Salman. And so that's why it's important for all of us to both call the question and to stand in opposition to these specific attempts at sports washing or entertainment washing when they come up, but to also ask the underlying question: who should be deciding how this money is being spent? Who should be deciding where the money should be going? You know, should it be going to buying a sports team in England? Should it be going to building a ridiculous magical technology city that's going to be a surveillance hub called NEOM, which is where vast amounts of money are being burned in Saudi Arabia as Mohammed bin Salman attempts to create a city out of nothing that could be the ultimate sort of panopticon surveillance city? Or should those expenditures be decided by the Saudi people in line with what a healthy society needs and wants? These are the fundamental questions. And as all of us sort of align and support the Saudi people's vision for human rights and democracy in the country, it's also an opportunity for all of us to continue to remind the monarchy that there is no political legitimacy to what they're doing, and what the monarchy is doing actually flies in the face of what a healthy government would do with vast amounts of money.
Thank you. Well, as we're bringing this conversation to a close, I want to return to you, Hadar, and zoom out a bit. We've heard so many details about the situation and how it's being addressed, but could you speak to the impact overall of the suppression on free expression on such a wide scale, and particularly on how a suppression of the right to free expression is inseparable and intertwined with so many other fundamental human rights, and how that's being impacted by this crackdown?
Sure, thank you. You've gotten a picture of lots of different aspects of what's going on in Saudi Arabia today. Details about the draft criminal code, specifics about where money is being invested to kind of add a sheen of legitimacy, both internally and internationally. You know, we're sitting here in Tiller House at the American Society of International Law, and I think it's really important to note Saudi Arabia has ratified 5 international human rights treaties, including the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women, and the Convention Against Torture. Saudi Arabia has sat on the UN Human Rights Council as a member. And in January of 2024, Saudi Arabia was reviewed by the Universal Periodic Review Mechanism at the United Nations. More than 135 UN member states made over 354, maybe it was 354. I don't think to say over 354 recommendations that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia needed to take up in order to improve their compliance with basic international human rights standards. Many of those recommendations had to do with freedom of expression and freedom of association. And why? Because those rights, those freedoms of expression, of association, are foundational rights. Everything else comes from that. So creating these small spaces for social media bloggers or posters to be able to express even the smallest dissent, the smallest criticism about traffic that leads to their arrest. Think about what that does when somebody actually expresses the need to reallocate funding away from a Justin Bieber concert and instead to create jobs for people on the ground. Or instead of bringing international soccer stars to the country, to actually enable women to get an education and to have jobs on the ground. 2019, PEN America awarded our Freedom to Write Award to 3 female activists who were imprisoned because of their advocacy for women's human rights in the country. At the same time that the king allowed women to drive for the first time, he imprisoned the 3 of them for their advocacy on behalf of women being able to drive. They've since been released from prison and from detention, but they still are in that cage that we talked about a few minutes ago. So as we talk about freedom of expression, we need to think about that as being so foundational to the other rights, labor rights, women's rights, the rights of minorities in a country, in Saudi Arabia. Because everything else comes back to that. You heard in the really detailed outlay of the draft penal code, how many pieces of it came back to freedom of expression, insulting the monarchy, questioning the credibility of the crown or of judges. So as we talk about freedom of expression in Saudi Arabia, we're talking about everything. We're talking about what it's like to be an individual living in an extraordinarily repressive regime where you can't have a conversation like this for sure, but you can't even have a conversation about the traffic. That's why it's so important for us to be raising these issues. Thank you to Amnesty for launching this campaign. Thank you to the various activists for what you all are doing and why we at PEN America continue to try to elevate and amplify this, despite the fact that it's very hard to break through in talking really specifically, especially in Washington, D.C. at this very moment. So I take it back.
Well, thank you so much. I think we're going to close this portion of the conversation now and move to question and answers. We have a bit of time for that still. Do we have any questions from the audience? I'll send a mic to you. If you could introduce yourself and also your affiliation. And for anyone online who would like to ask a question, again, just put that question into the Q&A portion on Zoom, and I'll be happy to read that question out.
Hello, my name is Marissa Carden-Weber. I'm an attorney specializing in international criminal and human rights law with a focus on strategic litigation. It's been really wonderful to hear from each of you. In addition to accountability and reform, I'm really curious about efforts to support defenders and artists experiencing fatigue or feelings of being demoralized. And I believe Elizabeth and Hadar touched on this a bit, and I imagine conversations like this one and the specific work that each of you do have very real impact on making targets of the Saudi government feel encouraged and like the international community is on their side. But I'd love to hear if there are any specific efforts that you've found to be successful or that you'd like to see supporting this kind of idea of defender fatigue. And also, I imagine some of you feel like you're in that category yourself. So thank you.
Want me to go? Sure. So you know, the pressure that human rights defenders are under, who are trying to squeeze out that space, that little amount of space that they can find to be able to express ideas, is incredible. It is exhausting. It is stressful. It takes a toll on mental health. And it is a source of enormous concern. At PEN America, we have an affiliated organization called the Artist at Risk Connection, which actually provides small grants to help artists who are in need of respite or who are at risk themselves. And it's a network of organizations that actually work to support artists who are in exactly the situation that you describe. We help artists from all over the world to kind of find opportunities to either rest and find respite, or if they are at risk, to help them find safe space. So it's one specific example. There are other organizations that do this work as well. I can just speak to the work that we do at Penn in trying to help support artists in that situation. Also, knowing the cases and being able to speak the names of people who are being subject to this tremendous oppression and these egregious violations are incredibly important. So we try to document that through our Writers at Risk database, through the Freedom to Write Index, and in any other spaces that we can find to amplify individual cases, because as we know, that can help to provide some level of protection. And then, of course, doing advocacy through international networks, in bilateral meetings, in any forum that we can possibly find, to be able to elevate the cases of individuals who are either at risk or who are currently in detention or imprisoned, are all important.
Sorry, it took a minute to write down my question. So you've all spoken a lot of, my name is Sharon Bosch. I'm a upcoming third-year student at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law. I'm currently an intern at ASIL for the summer. You have all spoken a lot about the issues and the crackdown and what the world should look like. Mr. Berry very briefly mentioned asking Western governments like the United States to stop participating with nations like Saudi Arabia. But Mrs. Harris as Ms. Harris pointed out rightfully, Saudi has signed on to various human rights treaties and is a participant in the UN Human Rights Council, with seemingly no mechanism to enforce these treaties or create such changes. I'm interested in understanding what you believe, this is open to whoever would like to answer it, as a practicality can be done to move through and pass these issues, be it in Saudi Arabia, in Iran, in North Korea, in China, and Russia, and so on.
Jump into. I mean, I would say that it's very context dependent, and these are all, important questions to ask with regards to Saudi Arabia, China, et cetera. But in the context of Saudi Arabia, I mean, in every situation, my personal attitude is that law flows from power, and laws affirm justice when power is brought to bear to achieve justice, and laws are either ignored or serve the interests of greed and oppression when that's where the power flows to, right? When that's where the power is exerted. And right now, and as has long been the case, we live in a world of realpolitik where the world is a chessboard, and people and pieces get knocked to the ground in the service of maintaining power, military hegemony, et cetera. And it's and what I've seen is that this is true whether it's Russia supporting Syria's dictatorship during the horrors that it inflicted, the U.S. supporting Saudi Arabia during its horrors in Yemen, the U.S. supporting Israel with its horrors in Gaza ongoing. These are all examples of the same underlying reality. And so for those of us who are attempting to tackle the question of human rights in government under repressive governments backed by the United States, we have the luxury of democracy here, or somewhat of a democracy, depending on how you look at the trajectory of things. But we still have power, and oftentimes that power is latent, but that power needs to be exercised. And the reason I spoke so critically of Biden in the context of him affirming Trump's policies is because I think a lot of times we can be, especially when it comes to what the United States supports globally, we can be a little bit blinded by partisanship into avoiding the underlying realities that our executive branch historically has continued to support brutal governments across the Middle East for decades, right? 7 of 9 dictatorships in the Middle East are backed by the United States. You add Israel in terms of its treatment of Palestinians, that rises to 8 out of 10. And so building power and pushing politicians and pushing office holders to do the right thing is critical to this work. And that, in my opinion, is the only way that we start to shift the power dynamic and the power equation.
Can I just want to just like right directly on that. So I think that the law and power equation is right on. I tend to talk about it as political will and building political will and finding political will, which is why the job of civil society is so incredibly important to try to educate and activate people to make sure that governments aren't just kind of left to their own devices, because then it results in this kind of support that you were just talking about, and why there are continuing efforts by civil society to try to really break through the fact that nobody's paying attention and that the bad guys are doing really bad things, and that maybe we as the United States are supporting those things. So creating political will along with kind of awareness that leads to shifting political will becomes very important.
Yeah, just echoing my friends here and my colleagues. So, University of Pittsburgh, by the way, my alma mater. So I remember Ronald Brand. He taught me, and the international law, and he was speaking about, like he said, I don't know why they call it international law, because for something to be a law, it has to be there has to be enforcement for anything to be a law. And like international law is like, it's not the case in international law, because yes, you get institutions, but there is no international police per se. There's Interpol, but it's different. It's like there's no international army that actually enforce this and make sure it's like applicable to everybody. So that's why it comes to what my colleagues here said. It's about like political will of the most powerful countries around the world, and that's why we need these things come into the role of civil society, the role of lawyers, the role of media, the role of institutions in these powerful countries to try to push as much as they can to apply the law the same way to Saudi Arabia as they do to China or Russia, for example. When Saudi Arabia wages a war in the south, in Yemen, should be treated the same, and invade Yemen should be treated the same as like Russia going to Ukraine. When Israel invaded Gaza, should be treated the same. When every country invades, regardless of their reasons and context and whatever, everything should be under the rule of law, and the rules should be applied, regardless of context or who or what, So again, it's coming to the basic idea of our role in these powerful countries to push for this for these ideas to be applied to Saudi Arabia, as much as they are, for example, to other countries that are seen usually as adversary.
Time for 2 more questions. Maybe we could take time, maybe 2 more questions.
Thank you. My question is for Dr. Lauda and also for anyone in the panel. I'm reminded of the human rights report that the State Department publishes every year. I understand why. I do. I understand the laughter is coming from. The last paragraph basically says, in essence, according to the law on the books, per American law, this country, Saudi Arabia, ought to be subjected to sanctions and similar measures. But due to our national interest, we'll give them a waiver. Given that line of that genre of legal thinking and the laws on the books, are there any legal venues where the American government could be held accountable for enabling and, in essence, empowering the Saudi government to do flagrant human rights abuses? Do these legal venues exist from what you know, other countries, European ones, like the UK, Germany, and France? Like,
this relates a little bit. My name is Isam. I'm sorry, kind of independent, but with a background in civil rights law, recently back from the kingdom, incidentally. But my question is, we talked a lot about social media and how this is where people are getting snagged up in the kingdom. And so I'm curious if there's any real sort of awareness of like how this works in terms of like how implicated are like, Meta or, these different companies that are based in the US in terms of kind of the police state. And in my mind, I guess I would think that the police state is very dependent on US-based companies like Google and others. And I'm just I'm curious if this is another maybe strategy you're talking about. Maybe how do we hold the government accountable? But I'm also curious in a similar way, how do we hold some of these companies that are profiting very much in these countries and they're helping support all of these terrible things we're hearing about?
Just very quick. My name is Maya. I am a rising junior at Williams and I'm interning at ASIL for the summer. I guess my question is, you mentioned the inefficacy of international law. I'm wondering whether domestic law should be treated as a lost cause. I mean, Loujain Al-Hatlou is currently, she's been released. I mean, she has a travel ban, but I'm curious what kind of techniques or tactics lawyers who represent clients domestically use to gain legal victories in a system that is so obviously stacked.
Go ahead, and whoever would like to address.
Okay, I'll start. Great questions. So yeah, basically, the national interest waiver. It's just like one of these things. It's like, so Sanjeev mentioned Leahy law. There's also other sanctions like Khashoggi ban. There's also the Magnitsky sanctions and other sanctions as well. And I remember like going from one office in Congress to another, talking about like why we have submitted such and such cases for Magnitsky and such cases for Khashoggi ban. Khashoggi ban, they don't announce, like even if they sanction, they don't announce. So there's no way to know, but at least the Magnitsky will have there is a way to know, and other sanctions sometimes announced and these things. So we said why there are so many submissions about all these bans, and we don't think there is a move in this. And we heard a lot of times responses along the line of, yeah, there is a national interest, and there is like these like policies of like with these allies, and we take all of these into considerations. And especially with the Khashoggi ban, it's actually announced by the State Department, so the State Department considers other factors, including foreign policy, relationship to that country, and other things. So it comes again to like not just political will, but like quote unquote, what I think short-sighted even interests for one administration or another. It's not even the long-term interests of even this country or its institutions. So yeah, I don't have honestly an answer to this. It's a 1 million question that you can't. But it's just like what we try is like push and pressure as much as we can. As my colleagues here said, we have the freedom here to speak and to mobilize and to work and advocate, and this is a blessing that we never had in Saudi Arabia. And we are taking advantage of this to push for the right thing, for the just. To advocate for the oppressed and for those who are wrongly detained or arbitrarily detained to be released. As to like other parties and companies, yes. I remember, like, for example, trying to get a list of the companies involved, just in one example, in the Neom and the Jeddah demolition. And I was surprised if like there are not just like, for example, Belgian countries and, you know, companies, I mean, and companies from the Netherlands and the UK, but also American companies. And it shouldn't come as a surprise, but I don't know, I was surprised. When we talk to people of Congress, like, look, these demolitions and these violations are not just like by the Saudi government and its local issue. It's something that is affecting and being enabled by American companies. Only by that they open their eyes and start to think. But still, nothing. Maybe we fell short of like pushing something concrete on that. But I think it's a creative way of pushing to stop these kind of violations. As to the local laws. Yeah, it's the thing is, like, in a sense, yeah, it's a lost cause, but I know a lot of judges that are really honest and just and looking for the right thing and like believing in reforms. I know like many lawyers in Saudi Arabia, friends and colleagues who are really great, and I really, you know, admire their history, their work. I know somebody who, for example, advocated for everyone who was who pushed for reforms for decades until he was stopped, like literally, and questioned and interrogated over his representation of these folks, and was threatened even recently in the last few months that his law permit is going to be he is going to be disbarred, basically. So he stopped because of that, fearing, you know, repercussion. So there are great people. Yes, there are people who still, by the way, represented the folks who are, you know, wrongly detained to some extent. Of course, there are sensitive issues to the government that they will, you know, they will really put in dangerous way whoever represent them. But there are cases that are like less sensitive, and so again, I don't know what to say really. It's like that's why we're pushing from here, because we want to change the laws, to have pressure, because we know the Saudi government cares a lot about international pressure, Western pressure, way more than local pressure, what the Saudi citizens will say. So that's why you're trying this way.
I wanted to just quickly make a couple of comments, I think, addressing like the question about social media and what does that repression look like. So a few things. I was going to note that Saudi Arabia, in addition to other governments across the region, have been clients of NSO Group and using the Pegasus software to spy on human rights defenders, political dissidents, even foreign government officials. There's certainly other clients of that software, including the Israeli government itself. NSO Group is an Israeli company, UAE authorities, and others. And so used both for, I think, domestic surveillance, but also of dissidents in exile as well. And other colleagues might be aware of other cases, but I was just going to mention that a former employee of X, formerly Twitter, was sentenced to a bit over 3 years in prison for spying on behalf of the kingdom and passing along information about Saudi Arabian dissidents' use in their account information on Twitter. Oh, I don't know if there's any other cases, but that's the key one that I'm aware of. And then lastly, it was mentioned a bit earlier, I think mainly around the murder of Jamal Khashoggi being like the most exemplary case of transnational repression. But just to note that Saudi Arabia is one of the largest what's the word I'm looking for? Perpetrators, thank you, of transnational repression around the world, using various means to harass, to intimidate, and to target their dissidents outside of the territory of Saudi Arabia. Thanks.
I'll add a couple things also on the question of social media. Under Elon Musk's ownership of X, the second largest owner is Prince Al-Walid through his Kingdom Holding Company. And he's a very wealthy Saudi prince who was among the Saudi elites who were imprisoned by Mohammed bin Salman when he came to power, and amidst allegations of torture. And when he came out of the Ritz-Carlton where he was imprisoned, he agreed to hand over billions of dollars in wealth to the Saudi monarchy. A portion of Kingdom Holding it is owned by the Saudi monarchy. And so, this is an example of something that's opaque. We don't know what the relationship is between Twitter's or X's internal processes and the access that its owners and stakeholders have to it. We do know in the case of Meta with regards to Israel that, Meta has played a role in shutting down accounts and pages critical, and Human Rights Watch has done a report on this. We don't know what Meta or X do with regards to Saudi Arabia. We don't know how these social media companies react to a quote unquote warrant from a repressive government, right? If a repressive government says, we want to know what account this is, we don't know, And so these are the ugly realities, and people who use social media under repressive governments often go to great length to either censor themselves or to hide their identities. But as Elizabeth mentioned, when employees at Twitter or X engaged in espionage, that's likely to have led to the arrest and torture and imprisonment of many Saudis who used anonymous accounts that until that espionage, the Saudi monarchy under MBS didn't know who they were. So those are some of the ugly realities. And of course, money is often a key factor in driving private social media companies' decisions. And in a world where many markets are ruled by repressive governments, the decisions they make may or may not be in the interests of their users or in the interests of human rights.
And I guess I'll just kind of bring us back to not only what is happening in Saudi Arabia, but the enabling environment that the international community has created to allow that to continue to happen. So as we talk about what's happening inside the social media companies, and I don't know what's happening inside, I do know that we signed a letter to the US Trade Representative for her withdrawal from opposing data localization for the internet. And that's a shift in US policy. It's something that could be extraordinarily damaging to human rights defenders, to authors, to writers, to anybody on social media anywhere in the world. And when we talk about espionage inside of a social media company that allows for the identification of anonymous accounts, right? If you allow for data localization on the internet, you don't need the spies inside. It enables the bad guys to find people who are just expressing their opinions or maybe expressing their dissent at any point anywhere in the world. So there are lots of things that we need to do vis-a-vis the United States government, in addition to all the things that we need to do vis-a-vis the Saudi Arabian government, to ensure the safety of people who are just trying to express their thoughts and just trying to express their dissent and just trying to express their desire to live in a society where they can aspire to realize their human rights on every level. So there's a lot of work to do. And it's so important that these conversations continue to take place, that you all continue to learn and educate and advocate on the very many issues that have been raised today. And that we continue to do whatever we can to help the people trying to create space for freedom of expression in Saudi Arabia to fully realize that on a day-to-day level without fear of being arrested, detained, tortured, or worse. Thanks.
Well, unfortunately, we're going to have to bring this conversation to a close. For everyone that's joining us here at Tiller House, please feel free to continue the conversation over some refreshments. For everyone online, thank you so much for joining and for following. There will be a recording of this event that will be posted, and I encourage everyone who's not been able to attend to view that recording, but also for everyone here to share it in order to maintain attention on this situation. So a few thank yous before we go. Thank you to our excellent speakers who have addressed this situation and this issue very broadly, but also very thoroughly. Thank you to Dr. Syed Al-Ghamdi, who shared with us the pre-recorded statement and highlighted the situation of his brother and the impact on families. And then last, thank you to our hosts and co-sponsors, American Society of International Law, Freedom Forward, and PEN America. Thanks so much.